I'm Pieter Wuille. I work at Blockstream. I do Bitcoin things. Today I will be talking about Miniscript, which is a joint effort with some of my colleagues at Blockstream, in particular Andrew Polstra. And before I start, I want to make sure to tell you what this is not about. Despite having released a software library a while ago called Miniscripts with a very similar name, it is completely unrelated to this, so I hope you weren't expecting me to talk about that. This is also not about any future soft forks or research into improvements to the Bitcoin consensus layer. This is all about stuff that is ready and available today. And it is very practically focused. So let's dive into it. I'll first give you an introduction, trying to explain what problem I'm trying to solve, trying to draw your attention that this is a problem space of contracts and scripting in general that's been overlooked. Then I will design a policy language for describing things in Bitcoin script, mapping it to Bitcoin script and describing how to spend it, and then conclude and give some future work. So, introduction. At a very high level, Bitcoin script is a Forth-like stack-based language with no loops and is not Turing-complete by design, and it is untyped. Bitcoin uses a UTXO model, so UTXO stands for unspent transaction output, which is a conceptually very simple model to reason about. We simply have outputs or coins. Every coin is associated with a script. That script defines the conditions under which that output can be spent, and they're always spent in their entirety. So really, the ability to spend an output in Bitcoin is finding an input that makes a particular script in this stack-based language evaluate to true. And that's it. When you can do so, you can spend your output. Unfortunately, this language is pretty hard to reason about and to use, despite being around for, well, since Bitcoin's creation 10 years ago. There really aren't all that many interesting scripts being used. Give my own reasons why that may be the case. And when thinking about script, the sort of things we want from it when designing new scripts, new policies, is something that is, of course, correct. We want to make sure that it's only spendable under the intended scenarios. We also like it to be size efficient, because size efficiency directly translates to low cost on chain. And we also want to avoid malleability, despite having upgraded to segregated witness a while ago, which removed most of the concerns of malleability or unwanted malleability in Bitcoin. There are still a few reasons why you may want to avoid it. So, let's talk about some of the things that you actually can do with Bitcoin script. The most easy example would be a specific public key must sign off on spending this coin. That's what most typical addresses in Bitcoin encode, but it is not the only possibility. There's others like escrow, also known as multisig or 2 of 3 threshold, where you say person A wants to pay person B, but they don't really, and in return for which B is supposed to return some service or good, but they don't really trust each other, so they rope in a third party in escrow, C, and you say, whenever 2 out of 3 agree, the money is released. So the sender sends the money instead of directly to the receiver, sends it to a policy or a script encoding the policy of 2 of the 3 of us must agree, and then the escrow can agree to which of the 2 it goes. The nice thing about this is the escrow cannot on its own run away with the money. He at least needs to collude with one of them. You can go further and you can add conditions like 2 out of 3, but after some amount of time you only need 1 coin, say one of the coins was lost, So we have some timeout built in. A common script used in other constructions are HTLCs, where you have two keys and either one key and a hash pre-image is revealed, allowing a spend, or after some time, just a key can spend. And really, this seems to be what Bitcoin script can do. It is Boolean operations over keys, times, and hashes. And the language seems a bit overcomplicated for actually just being able to do this. In particular, something that I want to focus on in this talk is composability. Say you have the example of a company wants to store its funds in a 3 or 4 multi-sig construction where a number of employees or directors of the company need to sign off for spending, but one of the participants already has a fancy hardware setup construction that has a time log built in, maybe is a multi-sig of its own with a cold storage key. Why can't that setup as a whole be one of the participants of those 4? This is, this seems like a very natural thing you'd want to do. I have my one application that I am confident with protecting my own funds. Why am I forced to just stick to these number of small predefined policies? So the goal of what I'm trying to achieve here is take any policy and within that policy being able to replace any key with another policy. That's what I call composability. And that on itself is an interesting goal, but practically speaking, the hardest part is how do you let software and hardware that are designed for different policies actually interact and accomplish this. I want to point out a tool called Ivy. I think the author had his talk earlier today here. Hi. So tools like that do help you construct more complicated scripts already, but I don't think they really give you a solution for this composability problem. And when we're talking about this, you may think, well, really designing a new script is something that only happens very rarely when someone designs a new protocol on top, designs a new application on top, and so on. But if we want this composability, that is not necessarily the case anymore, and that may be something you need to do on a continuous basis. So I will start by designing a policy language to just describe the sort of things I am talking about here. So as I started off, really the primitives we have in Bitcoin are you can spend with a public key. I'm going to call that PK and write it as a function that takes a key as argument. Multi for multisig, where you say k out of n of all these keys, then time t, or a hash preimage that needs to be revealed. But as I said, the goal is to be able to replace keys with other policies, so we need an analog to the multisig construction, which I'll call a threshold construction, which is exactly the same, except the arguments are now not keys anymore, but they are sub-expressions. And I have 3 specializations for that. One is the AND construction, which is just a 2 of 2 threshold that takes 2 expressions as an argument. And 2 versions of OR. And the reason for that is the second is the asymmetric OR, whose goal is to express that the first sub-expression is much more likely to be satisfied than the second, which I'll talk about more, but we have a probability model, and this lets you do actual optimization for minimizing the cost under certain circumstances. I want to point out that nowhere here am I talking about the witnesses. So there are no signatures in this language. The pre-image never appears. So it is not really something that computes anything. It is really a combinator language for designing conditions, and that's all. And this lets us choose the most efficient way of expressing how those things need to be spent at a later stage. So here are some examples of what we can do with that. PK, yeah, that's the generator of our group. I'm not going to write them all out in hex. I'm just going to use letters, but in the actual language, anytime you see a letter, you will have to actually provide a public key. So simplest version, 2 of 3 multisig is just multi-2 with 3 keys. A vault construction, which is something that after some time you can spend with 1 key, but there's another key that can always spend. HDLC can be written as an AOR of an AND and of a public key and a time, or another public key and hash. And to go back to our earlier example of the 2 of 3 setup that is part of a 3 of 4 setup, so you use the threshold construction, but the third argument is not a public key anymore, it's a multisig. I believe that this language conveys pretty much everything useful you can do with Bitcoin script today, with one maybe not all that useful exception. I can't express hash collisions, so there are some puzzle outputs in the Bitcoin chain that can be spent if you can find a collision for SHA-256, for example. That's not something I can represent, but if you are at all familiar with recent work in Bitcoin Core about output descriptors, you may notice some similarity. That's justified because I plan to treat this as an extension for the descriptor language that we use in Bitcoin Core for expressing all knowledge about how to spend a particular output. Ooh, so the next big thing is, well, how are we going to map all these policies to scripts? I'll first talk about the basic scheme, then some optimizations, and then define what I actually call Miniscripts. So the basic construction is pretty simple. You treat every sub-expression as a part of the script, a sequence of opcodes that expect its inputs, so its signature or whatever is needed from the top of the stack, and replaces it with a 0 or a 1. And obvious way of doing it is you translate a public key to just a key and a check sig. Multisig turns into check multisig. If you want to combine 2 sub-expressions, a way of doing this, run the first one, which will put a 0 or 1 on the stack. TAS on my slides, unfortunately, I didn't have space to write to alt stack there. So TAS stands for to alt stack and FAS stands for from alt stack. This is because during the execution you have access to 2 stacks, but the only thing you can do is move something from the top of one stack to the other and back. So to execute an AND, you run the first one, put the result on the alternate stack. Now you expect the input for the second one on the top, you run that one too. Now you bring the result of the previous one back and you Boolean and combine them. And analogously for OR and thresholds. Okay. Now, let's look at an example. What if I were to want a 2 of 3 multisig for a number of keys, but then also require a 4th key, D, to always sign? Following this naive execution scheme I had before, this would turn into this rather long script. And if you have looked at the semantics of script at all, this is really unnecessarily long. And the way we went about improving this is realizing that we can really execute or convert these sub-expressions using different, what I call calling conventions, about in what way does it expect inputs on the stack and how does it return them. So the original one, which takes its input from the top of the stack and puts it a 0 or 1 instead, is what I call E from expression. There's a second one that I'm introducing here is W, which stands for wrapped. And this is a version of converting to script where you expect the inputs to one below the stack. So you expect something at the top of the stack you're supposed to leave untouched. And for almost all constructions we have, the wrapped version is really the same as a normal version, but preceded with to_else stack and suffixed with from_else stack. This obviously accomplishes that goal, but for the simple checksig with a single key, this is overkill. We don't actually need to move to the else stack and back. You can just swap the two input arguments because you know you're only going to consume one. So what we're doing is really for every construction in our policy language, we now have two versions, an E version and a W version, and the arguments to threshold, for example, invoke the wrapped version instead, which means that we get rid of the to_else stack and from_else stack. Another improvement we can make is realizing that the overall script at the top must always succeed. There is no, by definition, because it will only run when you actually satisfy it. And when you have something that always succeeds, we can actually find more efficient versions of the particular code. The V version is something that always succeeds or aborts your script if it failed, but doesn't put anything on the stack. So it's often the equivalent of the verify version of certain opcodes in the Bitcoin scripting language. And if you, for example, have an AND at the top of your policy, you can really just compile it, the first argument as the V version, and then the second version as if it was at the top again. And this again lets you make more optimizations. So the result here is something significantly shorter. But we go further. Remember that I told you the policy language does not describe the actual encoding of the witnesses. So what you put on the stack we can decide later. And it turns out there's a whole bunch of ways in which you can write an OR. The one I showed you before is the parallel OR. You just run both and do a Boolean combination of the two. But this has the downside that you actually need to provide inputs for both, even knowing that only one of the two will succeed. So there's an alternative, which I'm calling a cascade OR, which is you run A, and if it succeeds, you return 1, and otherwise you run B. So this means you no longer need to provide the inputs for B if A is going to succeed. Switching, you can actually introduce an extra argument, an extra witness that tells you whether A or B is the one that is going to succeed, and now you only need to provide one. And you can go even further, where you say, I give you a value up front which tells you whether the whole expression is going to succeed at all, and if it's not going to, I'm not going to execute anything. Yep, a few more things. I told you earlier I'm trying to avoid malleability. In order to do so, the problem is if you look at the switching OR, there's really two ways of making it not succeed. I can tell you A is the one that's gonna not succeed, and then give an input that does not succeed A does not satisfy A, or I can tell you B and then give an input that does not satisfy B. And this leads to a malleability because it is presumed to be easy to find inputs that don't satisfy certain conditions. So in order to solve that, we actually need to introduce yet another calling convention, which is something that does put a 1 on the stack, but can under no circumstances produce a 0. And then yet another step is, what if you have an if-then-else, which has a check-sig operator in both of the branches? It would be nice if we could move the check-sig out. So in order to deal with that, there's yet another calling convention which, instead of immediately evaluating the check-sig, actually leaves a public key on the stack with which we still expect a signature to happen. So through that convention, we can optimize here and there a few extra opcodes. And the important thing why these things matter is because different scripts have different trade-offs between how big is a satisfaction, how big is a non-satisfaction, and how big is the script size. Sometimes you can find a longer script that needs less input and so on. So depending on the probabilities that something gets executed at all and the probability that it succeeds, you may want to pick a different one. So overall, if we look at all the things we looked at, we end up with 6 calling conventions for each of the policy constructions. We ended up with 58 combinations of different execution semantics combined with different semantics, including 14 ways of expressing an OR. We had a lot of fun writing a lot more and then trying to reason about this one can never be better than this one because this script is always this much longer than that one. Anyway, the overall subset of Bitcoin script you can obtain by composing all of these 58 constructions is what we call Miniscripts. And it seems reasonably efficient. In particular, we did find a slightly better script using it than a handwritten one that we're using in Liquid. I don't know if we've actually adopted it yet. There's a few limitations. Due to our composability construction, certain opcodes are really not usable, in particular depth, which tells you how big the stack is. Clearly, its semantics change too dramatically when you compose things, so it is certainly possible that more efficient scripts exist that use depth, but we will not find them. And a much bigger limitation is we really have no way of doing common sub-expression elimination. I have thought about that a lot, but I have not found any generic way of dealing with this. If only there was one opcode to oproll, but in the other direction, which is suspiciously missing, and if we had that, we could do common sub-expression elimination. We also found an efficient algorithm that actually finds the most efficient miniscript given a particular policy. It is exponential in the number of nested ORs, but in practice that's pretty usable. And I have to tell you, I am not a web designer, as you may notice. Really, this is just my C++ code converted to JavaScript for a demonstration. But so I could start by writing, for the demo here, there is a dummy public key, C, so I don't need to write a whole bunch of hex. And yeah, it will indeed tell me just use a public key and a check sig. What if you have 2 of them? There you go, we will turn it into a check sig verify plus another check sig. If you want to do something like an HTLC, or and time, let's say 1,000 blocks and a public key, or some hash h and a public key. we go. I hope that's readable. So it does construct a relatively efficient script for that. And it also tells you all the particular version of every policy it uses. So down here I also have a reference for all the various ways of how an OR, for example, is compiled. I'm not going to go into these details, but you're free to have a look at the website. We also have a Rust implementation, and this was pretty interesting. While writing this compiler, actually we sort of ran a competition between Andrew, who wrote a Rust version, and mine, and trying to see who came up with the more efficient one. And in the end, found out that we had significant flaws in both of our constructions, and eventually converged, so that's good. Okay, so I have so far really only addressed how do we deal with constructing a script that is a composition of certain policies, but I set out to do a bit more ambitious goal. How can we now actually make different tools that are designed for different policies interact? And to explain that, I am first going to briefly mention partially signed Bitcoin transactions, or BIP 174 by Andrew Chow. It is really a key value file format with metadata, which anyone with all information you may possibly need for determining how to sign a transaction. It gives you, if necessary, the outputs being spent. It will, if it's a P2SH output, it will tell you what the script is involved. For the public keys involved, you can encode what HD key path they are derived from, so a hardware wallet can derive them on the fly or anything. And there are 6 different roles associated with PSBT implementations. There's a creator who creates a transaction template, then an updater who fills in all the necessary information, and you have multiple signers who actually have access to private keys and produce signatures, and a combiner, a finalizer that constructs the actual inputs, and an extractor which produces a full transaction. In practice, most implementations implement multiple of these roles and often simultaneously, but what I want to point out here is that in the typical PSBT workflow, it's really only the updater and the finalizer that needs to understand anything about the input scripts. This is somewhat surprising, but it does make sense because when signing, you generally care about where the money goes, not whether it was already yours. Worst case, it's not, and your signature will be invalid. So an obvious way of thinking about it is, well, we have this nice annotated policy form. We could just store that inside PSBT records. An updater who knows the script could do this, and then others can actually sign. Actually, that doesn't even seem to be necessary, because not only is our policy language composable, the subset of script is also composable. And what this means is you can actually, there's a very simple parser you can write that, given the script, can tell you the policy again. And this means that we really don't even need to add any metadata to a PSBT to enable integration with this. That's somewhat of an artificial restriction. We very much could propose as an extension for that, but overall it doesn't even seem we would gain all that much by using a non-parsable or non-easily parsable script instead. So how do we imagine interaction to work? As I said, the scripts can be easily parsed back into an annotated policy, and given the annotated policy, you can figure out what subset of scripts of keys can sign, meaning you can tell PSBT, hey, these are the keys that need to sign. You can figure out what a policy does. You can also verify that a particular policy is a composition of the policy you desire with another that you don't care about, and the composition is always sound. And given the annotated policy, you can assemble a fully signed transactions from the signature. So at this point, I want to mention really how all this work came to be, and that was from a discussion among some people contributing to the Rust Bitcoin library and wondering what to do for signing. And someone was very much against a template-based signing that's like, oh, these are the few types of scripts we support, and only these are the ones that are supported. So we went on this roundabout way to design this thing, and in the end decided that really the language to describe the structure of a script can be the script itself, as long as it is within this subset that we call Miniscripts. Okay, so I want to conclude by saying Bitcoin script is mostly useful for simple policies, but there's a lot more possible than it is being used for. And part of this is because it's really hard to make things interact well. This sort of interaction, for example, also could over time mean letting things like a Lightning client and a multisig client trivially interact without needing to redo a lot of the protocol work, though I'm not an expert on the details here. And we can define a subset of script which can be generically signed for, which can be constructed easily, which can be analyzed easily, and as long as we don't have common sub-expressions, is reasonably efficient to work with. So I hope that makes this sort of technology more accessible. So the future work is we need to open source our implementations of the compiler and the parser. Right now, the compiled JavaScript on this site is probably not what you want to look at. It's around 0.5 megabyte. But once we clean up the code, we'll release that. We want to integrate the generic signer logic in common wallet software, which will immediately mean that it would interact with anything that supports BSBT or others. And could even mean like I have a hardware wallet that wasn't even designed for any of these things, but it will probably not give you a useful address in what is going on, but at least some of them will likely support this without needing to know. And obviously there's further optimizations. We use the relatively exhaustive approach in trying to find out all constructions, but there's obviously a whole bunch of things possible in scripts that we're not using. And maybe a bigger thing is use the things we learned from this for future improvements. Like, as I said, if only there was an op roll that rolls in the other direction, you could pre-compute a value that's going to be used multiple times and then insert it in the right position in the stack. And this is the only time I'm going to mention the other ongoing work into researching future improvements to Bitcoin's scripting language. Taproot and Mast can pretty much directly reuse the policy language. So the annotations will be different, but this should make upgradability easier as well. So you could write a policy now and presumably later it will just be translated in a different way to a future script version. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Thank you very much. We have time for questions.
Why not call a subset of script subscript instead of miniscript?
So I am, I think, notoriously bad at naming things. Actually, originally I wanted to call it Descript, as it's script with something removed from it, and it interacted with our work on descriptors, but people found that too confusing. I actually considered that name too, but
So because you can't reuse witness arguments in different expressions, you can't do pay to public key hash implemented within this.
yep.
If you were to extend it, I mean, I thought that was remarkable. Definitely that. As I think you pointed out, most useful stuff you actually don't need that, and I hadn't really realized it before.
Yeah.
But
Yes.
if you extended Bitcoin script, there's more I think you could add that would, like Merkle, like if you could do Merkle proof verification things that would make it useful to reuse arguments. So is there a way to do that while still preserving the composability of the language?
I would like to hear your opinions on this. In particular about pub key hashes, so in an earlier iteration we actually had a pub key hash construction, but if you think about it as expressing policies, the policy that a pub key hash implements is the same as the one that you do a hash at the top, but there's really no reason why you would ever want a hash inside. So, but yeah, reusing witness things. So we do have, let me see if I can show you, say the wrapped W version of the hash lock. We found that actually the most efficient and really the only way you'd want to do it, if you also want to include a guarantee that the maximum size of the pre-image is 32 bytes, because otherwise you may not be compatible across chains, is something that just takes a single argument whose size 0 refers to non-satisfaction. So there is a limited reasoning on reusing arguments in various places, but they're all encapsulated within a particular combination of, but I'm sure this can be improved.
All right, so that's about all the time we have for questions. We're about to hit a break though, so you can find Pieter and ask him whatever you want to ask him if he wants to be asked.
Sure.
We'll be back here at 4:05.